the romance has gone from the cup, and you can't recapture it, because in all of the games that I either watched or listened to commentary of, the difference between part-time and full-time was exemplified in all of those games. So, Batley were fantastic for 40 minutes playing
downhill first half, yeah.
But what beat them in the end, as well as players that are slightly more skillful who were full-time, is fitness. The same with Featherstone. Put up a great show against Lee, but ultimately a full-time professional team will almost always now beat a part-time team. I listened to Halifax and Catalan, and full credit to the commentator who tried to make out that it was a more competitive game than it actually was, because after 15 minutes, when Tom Davies has scored 3 tries, Halifax are not going to win that game. I listened to Warrington and London, and we know what the disparity is. London at the moment are almost still a championship team in transition. They're full time, but they're not at that level. And none of these games really were anything other than exemplifying the fact that oil and water no longer mix, and they're never going to. And you look at the crowds, and one of the things that people said was, when a championship team gets a Super League team at home, that's what we want the cup to be, and there'll be a big crowd and there'll be a big payday. None of those games had big gates. Because even if you go with the fact that it might be a slightly downgraded gate because it's shared, and less than 2,000 at Halifax, just over 2,000 apparently at Batley, it's not sustainable. So that even when they're at home and their home fans know that they're not going to win, they're not going to pay £20 or £25 to watch it. So that needs to be addressed, that full-time part. I mean, you can have whatever format of cup you want, but you're never going to address that. And the other thing is that these are all pay games, and we are now a season ticket culture. We're in a time in this part of the world where obviously economics weighs very heavily. So full credit to all the Saints fans that went 2 weeks running to Headingley and paid £20-25 each time they went. But do they really feel like they're getting value for money when it's the same game repeated? I think you're right. Subdued is the word.
Yeah, and one of the arguments that people would say week in, week out on Super League is it's on TV and therefore the crowds will reduce. Well, actually, we've probably not seen that yet. We've got a week, and I get that it's pay through the gates. The circumstances are completely different. But we had a week really where games weren't on TV and the crowds were low, so it doesn't necessarily follow. But the key thing is that, as you've said, people have to pay through the gate, and I think people just take a view that actually it doesn't really matter. If we get to a semi-final, I might go to the semi-final.
It's not value for money.
It's all about the final.
Because if you buy a season ticket and your average price of the game is probably £15 or between 10 and 15, depending on the season ticket deal you can get, to be asked to pay 25 for one game is disproportionately expensive. Not saying that the games aren't worth it, but we have bred this season ticket culture, which I understand because clubs are getting their money up front.
I was going to ask you, but then I thought you're not a season ticket holder, probably at least. But were season ticket holders offered an incentive to buy it?
Are they allowed? Because it's a shared gate, aren't they? So you'd have to run it by the other club as well to say, well, if we do the tickets at this price.
But would the same incentive be offered to season ticket holders for both clubs to say you can buy a ticket for, I don't know, 12 quid, 14 quid instead of 20 quid?
You don't know until quite late who you're playing. You don't know who's at home. You don't know the cost of hiring a stadium. So if you're Huddersfield or Wigan or Hull, you've got a deal in place with the cost of your stadium doesn't alter whether it's a cup tie or a Super League game. You're a limit to what you can do with your ticket prices. But I think that it's a fundamental issue about full-time and part-time, and nothing to do with what it was like in the 1950s, or if you want to go somewhere from here and you want to have group stages, then to me the only logical thing you can do is now to divorce the Challenge Cup from the 1895 Cup and call it the Super League Cup if you want. You can have a group stage at the beginning of the season so you don't have meaningless pre-season friendlies, and then you've got Super League clubs playing each other but for a reason. You could also do it in a way that maybe you've got 12 teams, so it makes sense that you could possibly have 3 groups of 4 or 4 groups of 3. those games are meaningful at the start of the season. You may well want to pay to watch those because it could be the first time you've seen your team play. You can make them derby fixtures if you want. The 1895 sort of worked, and you could have the group stages running side by side. Your Championship and your League One teams who are part-time then have the chance to get to Wembley solely through the 1895 Cup. Your Super League teams have more meaningful games, and you know that the likelihood is that from here on in, for time immemorial, the Challenge Cup final is going to be between two Super League teams. So call it the Super League Cup.
I was thinking about this earlier, especially with the FA Cup, which is the most similar competition we can think of. There's all this, it's almost a cliche, the magic of the cup. It's a cliche they just pull out on the TV when provincial side from the north plays Premier League side from the north. Oh, look at that! Look, Leeds are playing at Man United or whatever.
Leeds is provincial.
Well,
Let me pick up on that
Halifax
one.
Town
Okay.
are playing Manchester United. I tell you what, I was surprised Halifax played yesterday because Halifax Town's game on Saturday was called off. I was thinking,
Primacy of Rugby League.
can imagine Catalan's getting there and it gets called off. That's magic, isn't it? When was the cup last magic, if it ever was? When did the romance go out of the FA Cup? Because everyone's going to say now it's when Super League started, and then a couple of years later the grand final came in, and that took all the shine off the Challenge Cup final.
Well, I think when we went full time.
So then there was less chance of.
Yeah.
What's been the only shock in the last 20 years? Swinton beating Huddersfield.
Bradford beat Leeds.
Oh, Bradford are back. Yeah, I forgot about that. Yeah. And then Swinton beating Huddersfield.
But the fact that it's so hard to think of a shock. In
a sport like rugby league, it's different to football.
Yeah.
You snatch a goal that you can, on the counter.
10 men behind the ball.
Yeah.
But I think we were talking about it briefly downstairs. The thing about the football now, particularly the upper echelons, is that there are too many competitions. So if you're Liverpool, say, and you're in Europe and you've got the League Cup and you've got the FA Cup and you've got the Premier League and you've probably got to fly off on your international weekends and play in Dubai or whatever it might be. Clubs are now using the cup competitions to play their second string team or their squad players. So you've got a chance that there'll be an upset, whereas we don't have the opportunity to do that. So I don't think you can compare us to the FA Cup anymore. There could be a Portsmouth that could win the FA Cup. They might come up against, Manchester United reserves effectively.
And equally,
don't have that.
Those teams that are through that structure are full time. If you're in the Championship, you're in League One, you're still full time playing a full time professional team in the Premier League. So that the difference should in theory be less.
But there's been drop off in the FA Cup. And I think in all cup competitions, name me a sport where a knockout competition is absolutely thriving at the moment.
The old cricket competitions, the Benson Hedges Cup that was at the start of the season, wasn't it? The NatWest struck Gillette at the second half of the season. They were big televised events, but they don't exist anymore. Rugby Union got rid of its cup properly years ago, the one that had the final at Twickenham, which Leeds won once. Remember Leeds? Remember what I've to Leeds? And that's now just a reserve team competition, I think.
It would be a big call, though, wouldn't it, to rename the Challenge Cup in effect?
I'm not saying you have to.
Just for the fuss we've had with the Harry Sutherland Trophy.
You need the challenge. But what I'm saying
it remains as a Challenge Cup, but it's just a Super League.
The Challenge Cup is for Super League teams, the 1895 Cup, or whatever you want to call it after that sponsorship.
It's whether you involve the community clubs in that in the same way that the Challenge Cup is.
Well, I think they should be in the 1895 Cup. There's no reason why they shouldn't be in a cup that potentially gets them to Wembley. But what you wouldn't want at the moment, and we haven't got now because the Super League clubs coming later, is you're not going to get the chance of... the great thing for Siddle was playing Wakefield.
Former Giants Wakefield.
But I'm not sure that playing Salford will be of any benefit to them.
But if you go to a group stage, group Challenge Cup, which is in effect what IMG were suggesting, weren't they? That could you not build that into your season ticket and have have that designed pre-season?
Yes.
When you produce your fixture list, these are your fixtures in the group stages. It's included
because
in your season ticket.
You've got a certain number of home fixtures. Now, whether everybody in the group plays each other home and away, probably not necessary. But if you've got 1 or 2 home games, that is part of your season ticket. So then your 10,000 season ticket holders have got no reason not to go. I just think it gives more meaning early in the season. It gives you the opportunity, marketing-wise, to decide if you do want to include it, and why wouldn't you? And you get a great event at Wembley because you're appealing to different spectator bases. You're not holding out this promise of romance when it clearly doesn't exist. You know, you're getting excited about Wakefield being 80 minutes away from Wembley. We're never going to do that in the Challenge Cup.
No, even when we were 80 minutes away from Wembley, it just wasn't happening. So here's the ideas people have come up with, which, you know, why don't we have an open draw from round one? Now, interestingly, because it seems to be forgotten, and you can correct me if I'm wrong, for a long, long time, the Challenge Cup didn't have any amateur teams, or had one or two amateur teams. It didn't have this spread of teams we're having now in the Army and whatever else did. So, does that work? Can we just stick in, you know, Wigan in round one with?
Well, it'd be just ludicrous, wouldn't it? You know,
there's a duty of care issue amongst, you know, with the greatest respect to, you know, a community-based team. You wouldn't want them playing a professional team. It's, you know,
no, it just doesn't work.
Can you imagine Newcastle, who we all hope will pull through and make, you know, at this stage, that they were given York and Wakefield in the 1895 Cup. What would have happened if they'd been given a Wigan or St Helens?
I mean, I remember going to watch Huddersfield Giants play. It may have not been. No, they probably were Giants at the time. They played. Was it Blackpool Gladiators or something?
Was it 140 game?
132-0 or something like that. You know, that was a cup game, but I mean, that's a semi-professional team playing.
No, you don't want an open draw.
Right. So, what about,
in my opinion,
no,
this round of the Challenge Cup? As many people have brought up, Trust No One and Steve Mascord. This is the Magic Weekend. All these 8 ties are played at Elland Road.
But you've still got to have competitive games. And my worry is that you're just tinkering on the edges of the real problem, which is full-time and part-time don't mix.
And, you know, you're trying to sell a concept, aren't you, that may have been drawn 2 weeks before. If you're selling Magic Weekend, you don't know which teams are playing because
nor
you could have the previous rounds.
Yeah, nor do you know what venues are going to be available.
So
I also think as well that part of the problem at the moment is the Challenge Cup and the 1895 Cup seem almost divorced. So if you could line them up to be being played together, then you would get more interest and a stronger narrative leading you then into a final where, you know, both competitions end up at Wembley.
It's the date changing issue. People keep saying the date keeps changing for the final. Now we do get a year's notice.
Well, it doesn't help. We discussed that last year, didn't we? What was it? How many? 5 different months in however many years that we've had a Challenge Cup final. But that's not a reason why people haven't gone in their thousands this weekend to watch games, is it? Frankly.
On a weekend when there wasn't a lot else, to be honest. That's the other thing.
That's the other opportunity missed there, isn't it, this weekend? It's almost if we needed the Challenge Cup. Well, it can't be next week because it's rivals round, and we can't have Good Friday without Saints Wigan. The world will end if we do. We almost needed the round of Super League this week, so we can have every game on the telly, and the Challenge Cup the week before, but we couldn't have that because it doesn't work in the calendar. We need to be smarter about where we fit things in the year, in the way that snooker and darts do. That when there's an international break in football, there's something on. Even though this week there was nothing on. It was a really strange weekend when nothing was happening.
I know, you know, isn't it sort of typical of rugby league that we've had games on every week, and in the one weekend where you can think there's nothing on equally. I mean, I know it was on, the Friday game was on iPlayer, but dear me, it was terrible.
We're just going to build up to that and then talk about that later.
I think I'm glad I was there.
You were.
Don't watch it back.
Although we might be coming on to that soon. Carlston lighted at Wembley last year, so that's good.
I think the answer to the crowds at Wembley is legitimate in terms of that date moving. That needs to be fixed, and then it's a fixed date in your calendar, and you build to that, and then the scheduling needs to be fixed. But it's not an answer. It's not an answer for what happened this weekend, and it's not an answer going forward.
I also think that having it in the middle of the season is the right place to have it, so that you do have we have had 3 or 4 really good weeks to the start of the season. We know that the grand final now will attract the biggest attendance of the year. Something in the middle of the season that highlights you, and again, hopefully timed around a weekend when maybe there isn't too much else going on. Wembley still has a lure and attraction. Ask the teams that are playing in the 1895, both supporters and players, how much it means to them to be playing at Wembley, whether there's 3,000 in when the time their game's played or 23,000, it means everything. And I think if you start building that traditionally the date was early May. If we can stick somewhere in or around that date, then you can start creating a tradition. And I think if you've got 4 different teams there every year, plus your 2 women's teams who might make it 6 every year, then you've got an event you can build around. Whereas if you have it too close to the grand final, or we had it on a ludicrous bank holiday weekend, the last weekend before kids were going back to school, you were never going to get a different audience there. If we know now we're going to have it always at the same weekend of the year, maybe that's the middle of June, if that's now what we're going to stick at, and kids are still at school, they haven't started their summer holidays, and you can get back to that, let's take them down there and give them a day out. Yes, but you could never do that in August.
There isn't a simple answer to this. This is the problem. Everyone writes these articles. 5 ways we can save the Challenge Cup. Cup competitions are almost an anachronism from the Victorian age before they invented leagues. And when you look at rugby union, they didn't have leagues until the 80s. The 1980s.
It's worth persevering, because I think it's a commodity that adds real value to the sport. I mean, you've refereed a Challenge Cup final. It must be a fantastic event, even from your point of view, because it's such a prestigious afternoon in the sports calendar.
It's the oldest competition in rugby league, isn't it? And it still holds a soft spot in most rugby leagues fans' sort of hearts, doesn't it? I think that's why people are probably passionate and probably a little bit despondent about it in some ways. But I think you're right, that there isn't an easy answer. I'm almost of the view that the group stage is the way to go, because it provides the certainty of the fixture, and you can put it into your season ticket, and you've got to get bums on seats. And tuning in on Friday, it just looked terrible. And
when you think
talk about commerciality of the sport, isn't it, and driving revenue.
But when you think the previous week that venue was buzzing,
I know,
with double the amount of people in there, then something clearly isn't quite working for the fans. Because as a fixture, it should have been more exciting than the week before. Because the week before had been a really good game between, 2 relatively evenly matched teams. So you go in there with the hope and expectation you're going to get at least the same again. The fact that you didn't get it doesn't really matter. It's the fact that only half as many people went. So something clearly is out of kilter. And we've spoken before about, we have matches in pre-season that are duplicates of what's coming up in Super League,
but also
almost the week before. So if you turn that into something meaningful,
but the loop fixtures would go in theory, wouldn't it?
They'd have to
with the Challenge Cup group game. I'm sure people would rather see a group game in the Challenge Cup than. In effect, it's a loop fixture, isn't it? Because you'd probably play that team.
And if if you're getting a home fixture and you want to call that somebody's testimonial game, there's nothing to stop you doing that either. So I just think we need to play with the cards we've got rather than the ones that we think we are used to have. And it would be great if the 12 Apostles were still playing in round 1. And
it kind of feels, and it has felt for a while, by the way, that it only really gets serious at the semi-final stage.
Absolutely.
But I think that's the same in the FA Cup as well. I know we're comparing apples and oranges, but I think that's the same as well. As much as ITV and BBC can say magic of the cup, it's not really there until you're in the semi-finals. You are at Wembley in the FA Cup, and the League Cup's the same. Unless you are next to the game. What are the crowds like in the whatever the 3rd Division football competition, the Auto Windscreens Papa John's Trophy? No one cares about that until you get into Wembley. So,
but the semi-finals have been events, in the last few years. The semi-final I did Wigan Saints at Elland Road a couple of years ago. It was a great game, and it was a great day, and obviously it was a double header with the men's other semi-final, and on that day they had the women's final, didn't they? But I don't know. The group stage just sort of feels like it has to be the only.
But I would split it now. I do think that's the only answer. That listening to some of the games this weekend, and gallant performances, but an unfair advantage merely by virtue of the fact that full-time and part-time can't play against each other.
The alternative is you pick out the top 6 or whatever it is from the Championship.
But that hasn't worked this year.
The year I know it hasn't, but it provides some element of reward if you finish in, say, in that top 6 or whatever.
But what is the reward apart from getting beaten in a low crowd? What is the reward? I don't think that's the problem. This weekend has highlighted there isn't a reward. If
how many crowds will Batley get this year at 2,000?
But if Halifax had got 5,000, and if Batley had got
But then they only had a week to publicise it, didn't they? And
But
if it's in your fixture list, you can.
I would think that Batley and Dewsbury on Good Friday will get a similar crowd to the one
Probably.
Batley had for Castleford.
Yeah.
I know prize money is an issue, and obviously, as we've read, teams are losing money hosting games in the competition. But one thing we do have to remember about prize money is, told Fred, his adverts can be on the telly these days. He can advertise his bookmakers wherever he wants. Now, the good people at Silkcut, they couldn't advertise their SIGs on the telly because it was banned. So the only time they got TV advertising was sponsoring all of the sport, which is why I mentioned Benson and Hedges earlier, Embassy Snooker and Darts. Everything was sponsored by SIGs, and they could put money in because they couldn't spend it on TV advertising. Now, is that an excuse for prize money being rubbish these days? No, of course it should be bigger. Blah, blah, blah. But we've got to remember that fact that for 20 odd years this sport was funded by the tobacco industry.
But I don't see what upping the prize money does really, because it's not that the teams didn't do it a disservice. The teams are not doing it a disservice. It's just that there's not really the public buy-in to the competition really.
Yeah.
So if the public aren't buying into it, then we know where it will end up eventually. And so we can't sit here going,
and it's easy to say, oh, it's the RFL's fault because X, Y, and Z.
No,
it's not. You know, everybody's got a duty. If you're a season ticket holder and you didn't go to the Challenge Cup game this weekend, you'd have to ask yourself, well, why? I mean, I'm not a season ticket holder, so I don't. You know, it's difficult for me to answer. We can assume, can't we? But hypothesise. But ultimately, one would think, well, hang on a minute. I don't want to fork out 25 quid, but I don't have to.
We got a very romantic final last year between two teams that finished fourth and fifth in Super League. So, you know, what we want are the opportunity for, you know, Super League teams who perhaps won't make a grand final